The first of those is we should use our influence to get Canada's financial house, particularly the federal government financial house, in order once and for all. When reformers went to Ottawa, we have a 12-word statement of a fiscal policy for the government of Canada. And it's as relevant today as it was when we first arrived there. Just 12 words: control the spending, balance the budget, lower the debt, and reduce the taxes. That's not very complicated. But if that was done, it would make an enormous difference to the economy of the country, the job creation, and the disposable income. Now, the federal government, as you know, has balanced the federal budget. It did it mainly by raising revenues, not by cutting costs. But this fall, we're going to make a huge effort to make the next big emphasis in Ottawa on reducing the federal taxes. We have a proposal. We've presented it before, but it's now getting more attention than it ever got before, to reduce the federal taxes by 25% over 3 years. This includes reductions in personal income taxes, reductions in payroll taxes, and cutting the capital gains tax in half. The federal Liberals have had 6 budgets, 6 opportunities to reduce taxes and debt, and have done none of that. In fact, when the Liberals took office, the federal government was collecting $107 billion a year, or about $14,000 per family. This year, it'll be spending $149 billion, or about $18,300 per family. It'll be collecting that much in taxes. In other words, over that period from 1993 to now, the federal tax burden per family has gone up some $4,300. We're paying the highest personal income taxes in the world, and we think now is the time to make a major effort to get the federal taxes down. And we suggest the West, which has been more prudent in this respect than Ottawa, ought to use its influence every conceivable way: business, labor, community groups, municipal groups, provincial groups, federal political parties, to get the federal taxes down. We have a petition here we've been using and circulating at meetings this summer. It's called the Give Me a Break Tax Relief Petition. It will help us in making our case for tax relief with the Federal Finance Committee, the House of Commons Finance Committee, and we'd encourage you to sign that. The second thing I'd like to suggest that we use our influence for is to get certain social values that are important to the West, in particular law and order, and the equality of citizens under law, higher on the national agenda. At the end of the 19th century, Ottawa had to send mounted police to Western Canada to bring law and order. At the end of the 20th century, the West had to send reformers to bring law and order issues to Ottawa, and we think that that should continue. At the end of the 19th century, Colonel James Macleod of the RCMP made peace with the Blackfoot Nation. This was an enormous accomplishment because, as people in this part of the country know, the Blackfoot were one of the most feared native groups in the North American continent. They had a magnificent empire. You could see why they wanted to fight to hold on to it. Like when you think of that piece of territory stretching all the way from the mountains to the Cypress Hills and from the middle of Alberta to south of the Missouri River, that's a magnificent piece of country. And the Blackfoot were really the last. They held out to the very last. They were the last area of North America that ended up being taken over by the Europeans. But Macleod made peace with the Blackfoot on the basis of one principle, by promising one law, the same law, for whites and for Indians. In other words, it's the principle of equality. Treat everyone the same under the law, regardless of their race, culture, language, whatever, rather than different laws for different people based on your language or your culture. Now, we think that in the 21st century, when the majority of Canadians are going to be neither French nor English extraction, that the only principle that's going to keep this country together is equality of citizens under the law, and that the West should use its influence. That's a foreign concept in some parts of Canada. And the West should use its influence to make that higher on the national agenda. Now, the third thing I'd like to talk to you about, and this gets into the political area, is that reformers have proposed that the New West should use its growing influence to literally redraw the federal political map, to change the boundaries between the federal political parties, to make our system work better, and to be able to implement policies for the 21st century. We are convinced from our studies and from our contacts across the country that Canadians want a new Canada based on 4 basic principles. The principle of fiscal responsibility, that governments have to balance their books, control their spending, reduce their debts, and reduce their taxes. The principles of social responsibility, that say governments should give a far higher priority to the welfare of the family and to things like law and order. The principle of democratic accountability, that says that the federal government, in particular the House of Commons, the Senate, and now the Supreme Court, ought to be made more accountable to the people of Canada for their decisions and their policies. And the principle of reformed federalism, the idea that federalism should be based on the principle of equality of citizens and provinces, and that we should rebalance the powers between the federal and provincial governments so that our health programs and our educational programs will work for the 21st century. We think a vast majority of Canadians will agree with those 4 principles. We may disagree with everything else, but fiscal responsibility, social concern and responsibility, democratic accountability, and a reformed federation. Now, you might ask, if so many people support those values, how come they don't get implemented in the federal parliament? Well, the simple answer is in the last federal election, the Liberals were able to form a national government, a majority government, with only 38% of the vote. That's the lowest percentage of vote that has ever resulted in a majority government in the federal parliament. In other words, put the other way, 62% of Canadians did not want Jean Chrétien as Prime Minister, did not want Paul Martin's spend and tax budgets, but that's precisely what they got. And the reason we got that is because the 62% that did not want a Liberal administration was divided among 4 different political parties. And it was particularly divided between reformers and federal conservatives, particularly in Ontario, where in 30 to 50 seats, the split between us ended up just handing the seats over to the Liberals. And where does the Liberals have their majority? The Liberals is a regional party too. They got 101 seats. We call them the 101 Dalmatians. But they got 101 seats in Ontario, largely because of that vote splitting. Now, to address this, the Reform Party, and you could predict that this idea would come out of the West, based in the New West, made an audacious proposal in 1998. We said, why don't we convene a big meeting to see if it's possible to get, to define some principled ground on which to create a united alternative to the Liberals. If we got people that profess to be interested in one or more of these principles together under one roof, could we define a territory in the political arena under which people that are in different parties, reformers, federal conservatives, perhaps people in different provincial parties, others, unaligned people, could agree to unite to create a great, bigger than what we are now, united alternative to the Liberals. This was a proposal that would never be made by a traditional party because traditional parties don't like change. It had to be made by a new party that's not afraid of change. And my test, when people say they believe in change, if you want to test whether someone really believes in change, don't just ask them, are you prepared to advocate that others change? Ask them, are you prepared to change yourself? The people that are really committed to change are people that don't mind proposing change even when it involves changes to themselves. That's a real test. This was also a proposal, and it's the reason I got into some of this history, that the old Westerners would have hesitated to make, because the Old West was always afraid if you got into something big and new national, you never had the clout to preserve your own principles or your own position. It's only this generation, I think, of Westerners that can have the confidence and the audaciousness to say we can go to any national meeting in the country, we don't care where it is, we can not only hold our own, if we play our cards right, we can win. But that's a relatively recent development, and it requires sort of a belief in this new West in order to make it work. But it is a proposal that reformers were not afraid to make, and we did it.